So welcome. The scheduling of this book and panel is certainly timely given the rising crisis with Iran. We'll get to that subject eventually, but the point of the book, entitled 7 Pillars, and the discussion is to look more broadly and more deeply at the drivers of instability in the Middle East. From Yemen to Syria to Iraq, and now with Iran, the region, more than ever, seems in a permanent state of turmoil. It's become a land of endless wars. And tragically, despite decades of intense and often well-meaning American attention and the expenditure of billions of dollars, U.S. policy has more often than not been a failure. Maybe the caveat, more often than not, is too kind. It's been an absolute failure if one accepts that the basic aim was to foster stability and a better life for the people of the region. Of course, the ones ultimately responsible for a country's success or failure are the people who live there. But the catastrophe of today's Middle East raises a lot of questions about whether the United States should continue to be engaged in the region, and if so, how. In this regard, the editors of 7 Pillars, Michael Rubin and Brian Katulis, and their co-contributors have given us a gift. They identify 7 factors that affect stability or not and examine what they mean and the role they play. The pillars, as they identify them, are legitimacy, Islam, Arab ideology, the militaries, education, economy, and governance. I personally found many of the authors' perspectives to be unique and a useful basis to beginning looking at old problems in new ways. Whether it can serve as the basis for a new bipartisan approach in the current poisonous political environment here is anyone's guess, but at least the authors are trying to provide some fact-based reality and analysis to encourage debate. So with us today, starting with my left, is Michael Rubin, who's a resident scholar here at AEI. He's a veteran of the Bush administration's Iran and Iraq team and has a PhD in Iranian history. He contributed the chapter on legitimacy in the region. Next is Brian Katulis, who's a Clinton administration veteran, now at the Center for American Progress, with extensive experience in the Arab world. Prior to joining CAP, he lived in Egypt and Palestine, where he worked on governance issues for the National Democratic Institute. He contributed the chapter on governance. And then we have KADIR YILDIRIM, who's a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute at Rice University. He researches both pluralism in the Middle East and the interplay between religious authorities and foreign policy. He contributed the chapter on Islam. We're going to try to keep the conversation lively, and I'll interrupt to keep everybody from not just going on and on and on. We'll talk for a while, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So to start, I'm going to start with Michael and ask you know, what's special about this book? What did you think was lacking in the scholarship or the analysis that required this kind of approach?
Well, if we look at the last half century of American interaction in the Middle East, by any metric, like you said in your introduction, the U.S. hasn't been successful, and it's not a Democrat or Republican thing. What we wanted to do was, number one, get away from analysis based on the U.S. political calendar. That's too easy, and it doesn't work. But more broadly, do a fundamental rethink of some of the issues and drivers in the region. In terms of legitimacy, for example, there's common core assumptions in the United States that it's all about good governance. That's what builds legitimacy. But when we're in Iraq, for example, people are willing to forgo, in some cases, good governance just so that they can have a Kurdish nationalist flag or a Shiite prayer flag over a certain building. And we also wanted to identify and look at the impact of things we hardly ever talk about in the United States. In the region. Disruptive technology. How's that going to change things? How is foreign aid impact if legitimacy isn't good governance? Then is foreign aid geared to the right thing? And then another, in conclusion, just one of the broad issues that was most surprising to me personally when Brian and I traveled across the region was that many people, if we asked the question, what represents the most legitimate government in the Middle East, people tended to say something like Lebanon. And yet Lebanon is often thought about in the United States, and frankly in many parts of the Middle East, as an abject disaster. And so we were trying to grapple around some of these issues from a much more academic and less political or partisan approach.
All right, so what is legitimacy? And why is Lebanon seen as more legitimate than other places?
Well, first of all, we need to abandon this notion that one size fits all. And that's not easy for American policymakers to do. But ultimately, people wanted legitimacy for whatever their they wanted representation for whatever their identity was. The problem is, of course, identities change with time. What was clear, however, is that people were increasingly finding themselves disenfranchised. This isn't just an issue of the Arab Spring. It's not just an issue of the anti-Iranian protests, but there just seems to be a failure of the traditional isms in the Middle East, which is why Thanasi Kambanis wrote his chapter reimagining or reconsidering all the ideologies at play, because take the example of Iraq. 40% of Iraqis were born after the 2003 war. More than 60% of Iraqis were born after the 1991 war, which means no one has a functional memory of what life was like under Saddam Hussein among the broad swath of the youth. Therefore, they're no longer willing to accept, well, we might have our problems from some of the Islamist groups, for example, but at least we're not Saddam Hussein. People are looking at this generation which succeeded Saddam Hussein and succeeded many of these other ideologues and dictators in the region and saying, these guys don't represent us. We have in the United States, as much as we complain about politics, usually a 90 to 95% incumbency rate in Congress. In places like Iraq, it's around 12 to 16%. I mean, the fact of the matter is people are adrift, and that makes it a very dangerous moment.
So Brian, you wrote about governance.
Yeah.
The form of governance that has evolved or been imposed on Iraq since Saddam was overthrown.
Right.
Is it working? Do you see it working? Do the Iraqis have to come up with something else? Does the United States have to help Iraq come up with something else?
Great question, and I'll answer that in a second. I first want to highlight the subtitle of the book is What Really Causes Instability in the Middle East? And my simple answer, after spending nearly 2 years with Michael Rubin on this project, is it's Michael Rubin and neocons who are warmongering. It's a joke. To your question on Iraq, quite obviously, before this latest episode, if you see what's happened in the last week, and then what was happening just a few months before that, young people in the streets of Baghdad and in major cities in Iraq questioning the very old order, the political order that's in Iraq, protesting corruption, poor services, and a bunch of things that, quite frankly, when you go around the region like we do and we did together and quite regularly, are the sorts of things that impact every country in the Middle East. This sort of crushing demographic, social, economic pressures. And inside of Iraq, to answer your question, quite clearly, despite multiple elections, the current system of governance and government is not helping the people. And one of the points of this book, and it's not a new point, because if you go back to the Arab UN Human Development Reports of 16, 17 years ago, is that those structural factors that contribute to stability are quite weak. And in those 15, 16, 17 years since, they've gotten weaker. And I think in a place like Iraq, quite clearly, and this is where I joked about Michael, but we do have our differences. He was in favor of the Iraq war. I wasn't. He was against the Iran nuclear deal. I was. But the one thing that we agree upon is to dig deeper, and why we wanted to do this book, and in the chapter on governance, I talk a bit about Iraq, but not about its national governance. I talk about this experiment in governance that actually emerged under the Islamic State. I spent a couple of pages on it. And it shows you that responsive governance and discontent with a government that's not responding plants the seeds for the sorts of instability that we saw happen in Iraq under the previous prime minister, that groups like the Islamic State exploited. And I think we should have learned by now, many years after the Iraq War, that the United States can't fix these factors, but it's important to factor these fundamental building blocks for stability in our analysis. As we see today, the hot takes on what we're going to do next and the cycle of escalation, which I think is quite dangerous. And I agree.
ISIS was a new phenomenon.
Right.
So, and there has been failure of governance, failure of leaders in the Middle East for a long time.
Right.
So why at this moment did a group like ISIS have an opportunity to rise and have such a profound impact?
Well, I think it's multiplicity of factors, and some of it tied to this generational transition, where you just simply have a youth bubble that is crushing. And if the governments in places like Iraq aren't responding to it, people will rise up in various different forms. The ISIS model, which again was short-lived and I don't think had much legitimacy in the long run, was created, though, in response to an ineffective government. And there are more tools now. In a place like Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, it was a dictatorship. There wasn't as much open space for people to produce change. Mm-hmm. And I think the theory that was behind the Iraq War that in 2003, and we don't want to go back and debate that, but the theory behind it was flawed in that simply if we just topple regimes and eliminate or decapitate the top, then somehow freedom will spread. And we know that didn't happen. And I think why it accelerated in the Islamic State in particular is that you had multiple fights going on inside of Iraq, civil war first, and then a system of governance that simply wasn't responding. And that's the main point, is that those conditions are still there. Iraqis are still looking at their national government as with a caretaker government.
Carol, I would challenge the notion that the Islamic State was all that new, because if we go back in history, there's any number of millennial movements, whether it was the seizure of the Grand Mosque in 1979, or you want to go back a century before that to the Mahdi in Sudan. What I do want to draw out from what Brian was talking about, and there's any numbers of issues on governance beyond simply this, monarchy versus republic and so forth, but what does this mean for the nature of American diplomacy if we are still, in many ways, limiting ourselves to interactions with representatives of governments who are under siege, whether those governments know it or not? Are we missing the broader picture, both in terms of diplomacy and intelligence, when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, obviously, we've missed the broader picture a lot, and so what's the remedy to that? I mean, if we have the United States has to deal with the governments that are in power, no, to some extent.
I mean, to some extent, we have to deal with the governments who are in power. But for example, how much time do diplomats spend outside the walls of embassies versus talking and just interacting on the local market, as opposed to simply interacting with government? And I mean, we don't want to bring in U.S. policy too much, but one of the aftermaths of Benghazi, putting the root of that crisis aside, is just the lockdown upon which American diplomats find themselves. Right. And when you go to Beirut, and both Brian and I went to Beirut together, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut is basically living under the same security parameters that they did during the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. It's a tactical point. I think there's a strategic point, which I think for U.S. policy in the Middle East, we're quite likely at the end of a 40-year period that began with the events in 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and a number of things that led to the U.S. Having its engagement primarily be focused on what our military does. And look at where we are today, and discussing and worrying about what's the next move and what will our military do. And to me, this point that Michael makes, which is tactical but it's important, is our diplomats, and that diplomatic service has been decimated in the last couple of years. They are our eyes and ears in understanding societal trends, and we're flying a little bit more blind. More broadly, and the last point is that I think it opens up questions of whether the United States should actually be spending a lot of aid money and other things in countries that simply lack the capacity to do this, that maybe there's a strategy for thinking more modestly about our engagements, thinking about those beacons or outposts where there's relative progress in places like Tunisia, for instance. So maybe $1 spent in Tunisia and time spent in Tunisia may ultimately be a lot better than in other parts of the Middle East. But we don't even have that discussion these days because we're reacting to sort of mostly military moves and military-centric moves and not thinking about how do we diversify the portfolio.
I do want to follow up on that, but I want to bring KADIR into the conversation. Is religion more important in the Middle East today than it was before?
It is. It is very much so, but we need to go. I think that one of the fundamental misconceptions about Middle East in terms of religion, politics interplay is that we tend to assume that this has been the case all the time, But if you go back 40, 50 years ago, what we will see is, the dominance of secular governments, secular ideologies, and how Islamist parties and groups, they were existent, many of them, but they were much smaller, much less influential in terms of policymaking, in terms of being able to affect other groups in the society, or how governments were acting in terms of foreign policy or domestic policy. But over the course of the last 40, 50 years, things have changed dramatically. I think, the Iranian revolution Islamic revolution was a big turning point. But also, more importantly, something that Brian has mentioned, secular ideologies have failed, throughout the Middle East, throughout 1960s and 70s and early 80s.
They failed as leaders, you mean, and their ideas failed.
In terms of policy, the fundamental issues were political and economic, and they failed to deliver on their promises, on what people were expecting, and this is what precipitated the rising, I think, significance of these religious groups, Islamists, or later on Salafist fundamentalist groups, and later on more violent extremist groups throughout the region. And the key problem here, their rise was not just in terms of their own popularity, within their borders. Say, Muslim Brotherhood, in 2011, 12. 30-40%, of the vote. But more importantly, I think they were able to dictate the parameters of the discussion in terms of the policy issues that were ongoing. Their rise influenced secular groups, non-religious groups, political groups, so much so that they felt the need to bring in religion to their own discussions, to their own sort of policy sort of proposal, so to speak. One good example, I think, is what's happening in Turkey today. Erdogan and AKP have come to power in 2002. And he's a massive politician, but he's been so successful in terms of changing the political, sort of system in Turkey in such a way that the secular parties are unable to determine the agenda, political agenda. They are unable to discuss issues, in a way outside of the parameters set by Erdogan himself. And one problem here is that, if we think about this in terms of religious competition, from the framework of religious competition, that means, you or political actors, both religious and non-religious, will try to cater to the demand, the religious demand, because people will want more of that, seeing that it carries, currency in political debates.
But Erdogan has not been uniformly successful. I mean, he was successful in growing the economy, certainly in the early years, but he's run into more trouble now, and he's run into political pushback. So is there? It's Islam isn't. Do you see him using Islam and his religious beliefs more as a political tool to advance his political career, or do you think that this is just so indigenous to the people of Turkey that every politician going forward is going to have to encompass religious belief more into their way of?
Right. I can't speak to his personal beliefs. That's beyond, my sort of focus as a political scientist. What I can tell you is that religion is an important element of his political discourse. And when we look at over time, it changes in terms of the intensity that he emphasizes religion in his political discourse. So if you look at the period until 2011, 12, 13, from 2001 when the party was first established, religion did not play as significant a role. But once his political prospects were, I think, receding as a result of the corruption scandal first, and then later on, other issues that he's come up, losing, in elections to some degree, losing his popularity. Then he started actually using more religion, partly because he wanted to bring in some of the more conservative elements, especially from among the Kurdish voters in Turkey and some of the nationalist votes. So what we see is, depending on the time, his use of religious discourse, waxes and wanes. And this is really important. And this is true not just for Erdogan, but also other politicians in the region. Going back to, to an issue that Ryan mentioned about Tunisia, I fully agree. I mean, a dollar spent in Tunisia is going to go much further, compared to other parts of the world in terms of U.S. foreign policy, because it's a newly, democratizing context. And what's underlying, overall support for a lot of these religious Islamist groups, Islamist political groups, is economic and political issues. Once those issues are addressed, first and foremost, I think we're most likely going to see a decrease in their support levels. But I think that's really the key.
So are the Tunisians, presuming you want to follow up on Tunisia?
No, on a separate point, but that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, we'll say what you want to say, and then I'll ask
Yeah,
the question.
yeah. You use this phrase repeatedly, and I think it's pretty smart, using the religion.
Right.
And you talked about it mostly in the domestic context of Turkey, which I think is spot on, is to understand that people, leaders, use religion and Islam in their own way. And the point I wanted to make, 2 points. One, this is about power. We shouldn't, it's not necessarily about faith or the right interpretation of religion, if there is such a thing, but it's about power. And then secondly, in addition to the domestic use of religion, what I see in the Middle East right now is this multifaceted, multidimensional competition for power and influence. And the use of Islam by Turkey, say, versus Saudi Arabia, which has its own sort of definition and how it tries and it uses Islam as, the birthplace of it. And then the Qataris. But my main point is the first point, is that this is about power, not about some sort of ancient hatreds and some sort of essentialist interpretation of religion. It's about leaders trying to stay in power by appealing to sort of different themes and memes, and then also trying to compete with what they see as their adversaries or their competitors in the region through the use of, and that's the most underanalyzed and I think interesting aspect of it, because it spills over into media fights and into all sorts of things, and it's something that frankly the book doesn't cover itself, but it's part of the thing. If America wants a better foreign policy and approach, you need to understand that this is, in addition to sort of military moves and the use of terrorism and other things, a key part of the struggle and competition for power.
One of the themes, and I want to actually ask this to KADIR, of the book, is just how rapidly things are changing. And so if we look 40 years in the future, and you have a complete new set of, the majority of each population hasn't even been born yet, is the major influence for religion going to be the mosque, or is it going to be social media? And is it going to be legitimate theological rulers or leaders, or is it going to be populist leaders? And if so, how are traditional Muslim scholars looking at this rise of populism? And do you really think that the way in which people consume religion is going to rapidly change, putting aside whether the United States can even keep up with that?
Right. I mean, great question. So some of my research actually directly is trying to address this question. A couple years ago, we started a project funded by Luz Foundation, trying to look into how religious authority is sort of distributed across the Middle East among religious leaders, primarily Muslim leaders. And what we found is that there are a couple major findings. One of them is Islamist political groups or Salafi groups, political Islamist actors actually have great popularity. People do look up to them as religious figures, religious leaders. And this is something really important that's been rising, that's been changing a lot. In terms of social media or mass, I think that's a change that was precipitated at the turn of the 20th century, more than a century ago. Islam is a little bit different. It has a sort of a free market of religion, very much like Protestantism in Christianity. It doesn't have a central authority. It doesn't have a hierarchy. So what this means is, everyone can be a religious leader as long as people, willingly support or follow these people. So there was the ulama, the group of collective class of Islamic scholars, were big for almost a millennium between end of 9th into 10th century up until the turn of the 20th century in Islam. So they were the class as religious authority. They were the preeminent sort of religious authority, but once they started waning, once they started dying, so to speak, there was a big void in terms of who was the preeminent religious authority, right? So this is when we see the rise of political Islamists and Salafists early on in the Muslim world, and this is a process that's evolving with the rise of social media more so. I don't know what's going to happen in 40 years, but definitely not the mosques, I don't think. Things are changing fast and quick. Unless there emerges some form of a central hierarchical authority, things will be pretty distributed.
Is Islam a force for stability or not in the region?
It depends on what we mean by stability. If you look at Turkey, it is a force for stability. I mean, it's an authoritarian way, but it's a force for stability. If you look at some other, context, let's say early 2000s or 1990s in Turkey, again, it would be a force for instability because it was, stirring up the opposition. It was pushing them into trying to get more, political space, in the parliamentary representation or change policies. So it totally depends on the context. I don't think Islam by itself is different than many other religions. It depends on the political context. It depends on the actors. It depends on the overall sort of circumstances in terms of what kind of a role it fills in these countries. So it depends on the context. In Iraq, for example, or in Syria, it can be force for instability. But in, say, Tunisia, at this point in time, it can be a force for stability because of Ennahda's at least seeming commitment for democracy, in the words of Rashid Ghanouchi, in terms of Muslim democracy, for example.
I actually think this is one of the major issues that we're witnessing now inside Iraq, although it's not being framed that way in the media, in that when we look at Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who is the most prominent Shiite religious figure, he is apparently extremely cognizant of what the popular opinion is, and instead of simply leading it, he has to worry about following it, because if he goes too far out in any of his Friday sermons and pronouncements, he risks being exposed as the emperor wears no clothes if the young people choose not to follow him. And therefore we see a caution that really hasn't been there, if I will, since he lived under Saddam Hussein.
So that's exactly religious competition. These religious leaders are not blind to what's going on around them. They know what's going on, they follow them, and they adjust their discourses, whether these are traditional religious authorities or Islamists, more politically oriented religious figures. They know what's going on, and they will cater to those needs because ultimately what Islam does, what religion does for them is, they may be faithful believers individually, but Islam, religion is a tool. It's a political resource that you want to make use of, and you want to make sure it helps you in terms of your power, struggle. I think this is really the key point.
From time to time, there's talk about reforming Islam. Does that have any value? Is that something that, and I would throw this out to all of you, is that something that the West should be encouraging? What does it mean? What does it even mean?
It's happening. What I don't understand, it's an organic process that I see as happening. And my own view is when you say the West, I'm taking that as mostly governments and things like this. And I don't think necessarily we need to play a role in that. When I look back on, certainly right now, we have a president who, when he ran as candidate, he said, "I think Islam hates us." But, he used sort of an interpretation of Islam, which I think is quite dangerous, catering to, I think, certain political constituencies here. Deeply unhelpful. But I also, and I'm not making a comparison or a parallel between the two, I think when the US did things like appoint special envoys to the Organization of Islamic Conference, I thought it was anywhere from irrelevant to maybe slightly unhelpful, because I don't think it should be US policy to sort of encourage some sort of reform of Islam. It's a religion. It's going to sort of have strands that are more extremist and more reformist, and it's organic, and it's playing out. And my friends, I'm not a Muslim, but my friends who live here in America or in Europe, there are different sort of ideas about their own faith and religion, and I would stay away from sort of that as a use of engagement. When President Obama spoke in Cairo, there was sort of an idea of Muslim engagement that a lot of my friends in the Arab world found a little bit offensive, especially those friends who were, say, Christian or were not Muslims of tradition but not of faith, and wanted to be engaged as Egyptians or something else.
Let me approach this a slightly different way, not surprisingly, for my dewy-eyed liberal friend. I think one of the issues where American policy gets caught in a trap is due to our own navel-gazing. One of the most interesting experiments which is occurring in the region is in Morocco. When it comes to the Morshadat program, in which women are educated to be community prayer leaders alongside men. And Morocco, of course, has a theological and intellectual history that goes back well over a millennium. Except when you talk to American officials about what Morocco is doing and the Moroccan model, oftentimes what you hear is that, well, Morocco is peripheral. Morocco is irrelevant to the broader Islamic world, but intellectually and theologically, what's happened in Morocco traditionally in the Maliki school is much more significant than what's happened in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, had the advantage of oil, which is why a much more minority interpretation spread. But we seem to be doing Saudi Arabia's work for them when we are so dismissive of other trends. Because we see from our vantage point them as peripheral. And so sometimes I would actually argue, and it looks like KADIR may disagree with me a little bit, but our own perspective from Washington can actually get in the way. I agree with Brian that there has to be a limit to what we do in terms of this sort of religious debate, although we can't ignore it completely. But on the other hand, our first rule should be first do no harm. You disagree with me from your...
Not necessarily disagree with you,
okay.
but I have a little bit of a different take, I think.
So I don't disagree with you, but I disagree with you.
So I'm a Muslim myself, and I do think that Islam is in great need of reform. I don't think there is any denying to that. The Muslim world has a great problem in terms of underdevelopment at this point in time with violence. I'm not saying religion causes this violence, but there is a pervasive, case of violence throughout the Muslim world. If you look at the Muslim world today, I can't remember the figures, but 8 or 9 Muslims that are being killed today are being killed by other Muslims, and that I think is a very important statistic. We have pervasive underdevelopment, under-education in the Muslim world. A lot of issues and problems, and one great book that addresses these issues by Ahmet Kuru, recently published by Cambridge University Press, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. Highly, important book, I think, that looks into these issues very critically. But the point is, there is a great need for reform. And religion, whether we like it or not, is being used or justified, or is used to justify ongoing trends, issues, and problems in the Middle East. A great problem of patriarchy, for example. A great problem of gender inequality. I mean, in Tunisia recently, just last year, there was debate about introducing legislation for equal inheritance. And the most progressive of Islamist parties, and Nahda, opposed this legislation. And what are you going to do with it? I mean, this is, I think, really important issue. So I do think there is a great need for reform in Islam, because I think Islam, or Muslims rather, are still trying to, in my opinion, are struggling, trying to come to terms with modernity. And this is a big issue, I think. This is a very deep-seated issue that needs to be addressed. But with the current state of affairs, it's very difficult to come to terms with that part of the problem, something I try to emphasize about how Islamists and Salafists and fundamentalists have been so influential. They've been able to change the mindset, not only of those who are conservative, but also on the secular side. A lot of these issues, if you look at the issue of LGBT issues, for example, right? A century ago, I think the Muslim world was much more progressive on this particular issue, for example. On many other issues, ethnic, religious diversity, I will argue that the Muslim world was much more progressive a century or 2 centuries ago. And this is, I think, really the crux of the issue. This is when I said, Islamists are so important, not so much because they have, 30 or 40% support, popular support, but because they were able to reshape the mindset of a lot of people in their societies.
So
we're
both going to
we're going to make the same point, I think. And you mentioned LGBT, and it's a story from one of our trips in research, I think. And he can correct me if I'm wrong. We went out and met with officials and talked to people, but we went to universities. And I remember we were in Morocco. Michael talked about
Mohammed V University.
Mohammed V University, and we asked to do a sort of town hall with students, university students. And it was one of these give and take. And we said, look, we're here from America. And you might find this alarming or interesting that a lot of people are puzzled about America today. So the students were asking us what's going on and what's happening here. But then we asked them this one question: what's different about your generation from your parents' generation? And one woman who had a head covering raised her hand. She said, well, some of us are LGBT and lesbian, and we talk about it openly, and then they debated for at least 10 or 15 minutes.
Whether they could bring someone home to their parents, for example, who is LGBT.
And you pointed out that in other countries like Iraq, it's not necessarily the case. It's so taboo. So it's just, again,
it almost seems like that younger generation is starting to shift back from, the question is whether the generations we've had over the last 40 or 50 years, which you're identifying, KADIR, are the outlier or the signifier of a continuing trend.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not just about, at the individual level, but at the public policy level, I think there was much more, tolerance about many of these issues than it is right now, right?
Fair enough.
I mean, how many Muslim majority countries is there, death penalty for, or other kinds of penalty for?
And apostasy and things like this.
Or apostasy, these are, I think, important issues. Can you, build a mosque in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, I understand if they want to exclude Medina or Mecca because of, religious reasons or whatever, but what about the rest of the country? Officially, you cannot, in Saudi Arabia, and I think this is a big problem.
Fair enough.
So does this change have to come organically, or is there a role for, I don't know, the clerics? Is there a role for government leaders? How does reform, you say reform is needed, how does this reform come about?
It's a taboo subject right now. It's very difficult to introduce this subject. I mean, in several countries, those people, individuals, whether they were scholars or just prominent figures who wanted to introduce debate and discussion about Islamic reform have been, essentially castigated. Some of them were penalized for other reasons, but that it was a pushback from government officials or others in terms of their official stance or being critical of Islam, so to speak. This is what they understand from introducing debates about Islamic reform. I think a fundamental issue is, again, going back to socioeconomic development. Unless you have good education systems where you are able to introduce critical thinking, analytical thinking, you improve equality in the country, you improve socioeconomic sort of or economic development, well-being of a lot of these, people in these countries. I think it's very difficult. to introduce.
Okay.
Go ahead. You go.
Well, I mean, we're in a think tank, so we're going to be policy prescriptive for a second. Back during the Bush administration, I think around 2002, there was a case of Saadettin Ibrahim, the Egyptian-American sociologist who was imprisoned in part for what he was talking about in terms of reform. And the Bush administration held up something like $120 million worth of aid. I think if we go further back during the Reagan administration and we look at the issue of abrogation in Islam, and there was a Sudanese scholar, I'm forgetting his name, who talked about I'm sorry?
Abdullah Naim?
No, it was actually someone else. But he talked about how reform should include the need for reverse abrogation, putting the early verses of the Quran ahead of some of the later verses, and he was, of course, executed by the Numeri regime. The point of this is, while the United States, we have separation of church and state, does that mean that, A, we can ignore religion in other countries, and can we use the leverage of our purse, for example, in order to create some sort of space so that the people who are being most bold on the course of reform don't end up in prison or worse?
Yeah, this is an important point. And
Okay.
just three quick ones for U.S. policy.
Yeah.
Number one, listening and understanding. What we were saying before, getting diplomats outside of the wire. The tragedy that Ambassador Chris Stevens, who was killed in Benghazi, he was adept at doing this and was as powerful, I think, as some elements in our military to understand what are the social dynamics, I think is important. Number two, keeping this issue of democracy, governance, and freedom on the U.S. policy agenda, I think, is really important. And obviously, it's been downgraded under President Trump. I would submit that that's a pre-existing condition, that actually started that process of not having as much sort of focus in terms of what our diplomats do. It started under the Obama administration for a number of reasons, because we wanted to pull back, because we define, and there's this distorted debate about democracy, equating it with interference of the sort that Russia did in our own economy, and it's totally in our own government and things like this.
But you
And then-
think democracy is something the United States should still
I
promote?
actually think that what Michael was saying about Saadettin Ibrahim, when somebody's imprisoned, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or other
Raif
partners,
Badawi, for example.
Raif Badawi,
Right.
we need to raise our voice and make it part of the conversation and be serious about it. It's not
And
happening
that
right
should
now.
be a bipartisan issue.
But that's
There's
a-
no reason why it can't be.
That's a human rights issue. That's not necessarily promotion of democracy as a
But the strategic goal would be to create a safe space. and
For
protect
the
that
reform to
safe
happen.
space.
And that's the main point, is if you don't, and this is why I'm skeptical of the top-down attempts at reform in places like Saudi Arabia, because if you do that while maintaining your position as an absolute monarchy and don't give organic space for people to debate religion or other issues, it's likely to fail. And then the third point, and it's a simple one, and it relates to what you said at the top, Carol, is don't do harm. Wars actually are one of the worst things, and flawed wars and unnecessary wars that actually enhance the hardliners and hardline interpretations of religion. So, sort of extremists there feed off of this. And this is where I think we have to have a new style of engagement in the Middle East that, as I was saying earlier, tries to learn the lessons from the last 40 years, and especially the last 15 years or so, and then talk about what's sort of the right level of engagement. And it's mostly in this diplomatic, political, social space and understanding what's happening.
I just want to clarify one thing that Brian said, or add to it. I'm not contradicting you, don't worry. I'll do that later. But when it comes to reform, oftentimes when we talk about reform and when the Middle East thinks about reform, it's apples and oranges. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia. What is a reformed absolute monarchy? A reformed absolute monarchy is a reformed absolute monarchy. It's not a democracy. Right. And so sometimes it seems that our conversations in Congress across the political spectrum and in USAID and so forth with regard to what is reform versus what is understood by people in the region are two different things. And when the clash occurs between those two different definitions, it can actually make things a lot worse.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question.
Can I
Yeah, sure,
add?
Yeah.
sure.
So in terms of what role does can United States play? I think it's very important to understand that any kind of intervention. I mean, I think those safe spaces should be created, but I think the way they are created is very important because anti-Westernism is so much ingrained in political Islam or fundamentalist interpretations, or even among seculars. Any kind of intervention by the U.S., by European Union or other European countries is going to be deemed as as problematic, and that's why those kinds of interventions in terms of creating those spaces should be done really very carefully, because it's going to undermine, you're going to basically, make the issue very toxic, whatever that person, Saadettin Ibrahim or whoever says or does after that point onward is going to be a problem.
But we had this debate during the Bush administration, because what happens, for example, in the case of Iran, when the Iranians will say, even when we're not touching someone, when we're not supporting someone, that they're supported by the Americans, it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so shouldn't we use our ability to compel governments not to arrest certain people? Not necessarily fund them, but to compel them not to arrest, since they're going to be slandered no matter what they do.
Right. No, I mean, all I'm saying is I think it should be done in a way that's going to... That's not going to undermine the bigger goal.
America likes to use an axe rather than a scalpel, and that's a constant problem of the American bureaucracy.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it to the audience. So there's a whole chapter in this book on the militaries, which I actually found very interesting. And
By Florence Galp, who...
Yes, yes. And a big point that was made is that the militaries in the region have attempted 73 coups since 1932 and succeeded in 39 of them. The point being that the militaries are often a force for instability, not for stability. And it also hammers the point that a lot of these militaries suffer for lack of training, for lack of equipment. The United States has spent decades training officer corps, whether it's in Turkey or Egypt or wherever. It has sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to a lot of these countries. Was that for naught? And two, I mean, how can you say so many of these militaries are under-resourced when it seems like all we do is spend military aid?
A couple points on this. I mean, consider the collapse of the Iraqi military in 2014. We had invested $25 billion in that. Of course, we've also invested a great deal in Afghanistan as well. Now, Florence Galp's chapter was actually fascinating, so I'm glad that you highlighted it. A couple things that come into play. One of the reasons why, aside from perhaps being destabilizing in their own countries, Middle Eastern militaries should have a big question mark over them is, of course, they've seldom won wars. They've seldom professed to do what they say they're going to do. Part of that also has to do with differences in culture with regard to shame. I mean, when a sergeant in basic training when a drill sergeant breaks down a new recruit, the idea isn't simply to break them down, it's to make them better soldier. Likewise, in the Navy, when a chief breaks down someone, it's to make them a better sailor or pilot. But if honor is wrapped up in how you're perceived rather than in what you do, then this can have an implication on your ability to actually correct mistakes. Putting that aside and bringing this to what Brian was talking about, rightly so, in having diplomats be the front and center. If you look at a country like Pakistan, during, I think it was 2007, you had the Kerry-Lugar Amendment, which was a bipartisan approach to say, look, the face of American diplomacy shouldn't be the military and it shouldn't be the CIA, even though that's what it's been for decades in Pakistan. And so they put forward a $7 billion aid package, and it actually made anti-Americanism worse. Why? Because the military, which was about to get cut off from this gravy train, started suggesting through the rumor mills and so forth that this money was meant to Christianize Pakistan, which was nonsense. And it was also an insult. All the accounting mechanisms were an insult. One of the issues I would say that we have to deal with across the board as we try to get diplomats front and center, it doesn't make sense resourcing the State Department and saying that that's going to solve the problem if they're stuck behind walls. But when it comes to the military in Egypt and Pakistan, I think there is what I would call a cycle of extortion, in which we give money in order to have the local militaries fight the Islamist insurgents. But at some point, the idea has dawned that if we defeat the Islamic insurgents, then we are never going to be able to, we're going to be cut off from money. So when you look at the Egyptians and the Islamic State in northern Sinai, for example, which is it? The Egyptian army can't defeat the Islamic State because they don't want to or because they're incompetent. But it's one or the other. And then when it comes to the military in general, it's not just the coup issue. Brian and I were also in Egypt together, and you could argue, perhaps cut President Sisi some slack for making some of the corrections which he needed to make economically, which were 50 years overdue. But instead of building a platform for new economic development, what he's done is the military's come in for its own unique interests and is repeating all the mistakes which the military had made for the previous 55 decades, which means that what Sisi is doing is just gratuitously cracking down on human rights rather than improving the status of Egyptian society.
Yeah, if I could add some thoughts to supplement that, because I agree with what Michael said, is what I was trying to say before, the last 40 years, and especially the last 15 years of US policy, we really need to have a strategic questioning of using arms sales and military aid as a tool of engagement with these societies to produce stability and the sorts of things we're trying to get at in this book, if that makes sense. Because it has not succeeded in places like Egypt, which we've talked about before. Internally, I think it's, again, tilted the balance of power against freedom, and it's corrosive, and it doesn't lead, and it reinforces what is essentially still a state-centric system, and also reinforces the authoritarianism, which again, I don't think is sustainable in the long run. But bigger picture, you look across the region, and especially the hundreds of billions that we've either sold or delivered to Gulf states and others, there needs to be a serious questioning, because in essence, when I look at it, there is a dangerous and dysfunctional dependency on the US military approach. Look at it today, look at it just this past week. And a lot of these militaries are in the region themselves can't defend themselves. Look what happened in September in Saudi Arabia. How the hell did that happen if we had sent them sort of defensive systems and things like this? And that's the main point, is that there, and you see it here in Washington, is that there's this episodic and largely tactical and emotional debate that I think in some ways, I think it's important, right? It's a reflection of a lot of Americans saying, what the heck? But it's often not strategic. It often assumes that this sort of tool of assistance or sales, if we cut it off, then we've read them the Riot Act, and that's it, and they'll change. And I actually think we need to sort of, again, have somewhat of a fade back from these tools and emphasize the other aspects, because what we've done with all of these arms sales has not produced the stability in the region and inside these countries themselves.
Okay. Anybody got any questions?
Can we just ask that you identify yourself if you do have a question?
Yeah. The gentleman in the back.
Jeremiah Rosman with the Association of the U.S. Army. I had a question about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think for a while, especially in the 90s, there was this belief that all roads to Middle East stability went through solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Do you see a kind of realignment, especially now, between Israel and some of the Sunni Arab states in the Middle East? And what do you see as the continued importance for regional stability of that conflict today?
What I would answer just very briefly is decades of incitement remain. So even if governments and the diplomatic posture of many of the Gulf states has altered, that doesn't necessarily trickle down to the various populations in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. What I would say is, for example, Brian alluded to how we went to Mohammed V University. Whenever I travel, either with Brian or independently, I'll try to do roundtables at universities because they have much less of a filter than diplomats and embassies do. And when I was doing something at University of Kufa in Iraq, one of the things that was strange is in a 3-hour session, no one brought up Israel once. People brought up Saudi Arabia quite a bit. And what I would argue is the problems are looming so great throughout the region that people are focusing on their own immediate problems. Now, that doesn't mean that the Arab-Israeli conflict isn't important, but I would say that there's a greater and broader perspective throughout the region than perhaps traditionally American diplomats have had.
I would say there's a shift, but not a realignment yet. And I used to live in the West Bank and Gaza in the 1990s and lived in the region. There's a shift in that it's not as high priority, but I don't see a realignment in that. I don't see what in essence many Gulf officials and others say, look, we have this relationship that's in the closet or underneath the table with Israel, mostly on intel and concerns about Iran, but we're not going to come out publicly so long as there's this sense of injustice, this sense that there's not a sustainable, just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I would add, I don't see the pathway there at all. And if you look at sort of the reactions to it of President Trump's initiatives, whether moving the embassy to Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, the decision, it was muted in the streets, but in officialdom, Saudi Arabia and other countries had conferences that condemned this, right? And they issued communiques, and that's all you got. But my main point is that I don't see realignment, meaning like open relations between a lot of these countries, breaking out without any sort of sense of a pathway to resolving the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
Anybody else?
Question here.
I'm sorry. Did you see somebody that I didn't? Oh, sorry about that.
My name is Bill Chip.
Just a second.
I'm sorry. My name is Bill Chip. I've written a little bit about the Middle East, but not as much as any of you have. I thought when you talk about the Middle East in your book, I'm not sure how far east and west you go, but I think your discussion today is mostly focused on that little area from Lebanon to Iran. Is that correct?
We cover different authors will bring up different examples, but we cover from Morocco through Iran, a little bit on Pakistan. The chapter on education by Michael Fay, who's a professor of education at University of Michigan, focused heavily on North Africa.
Okay. I say one quick comment and then a question on when you say that while we maybe here tend to look at all these problems as religious issues, one form of religious extremism against another, we have to remember that in many cases, religion has been adopted as a tool to gain power, not the other way around. And my comment is maybe the big exception to that is Afghanistan, where I think religion is what's driving, the people who are trying to take over the country are doing it for purely religious reasons. But that's a comment. The question is, in the area you focused on, there are two ancient historic divides. There's the religious divide between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and there's the ethnic divide between the Persians and the Arabs. I think I'm not wrong that more people died in the war between Iraq and Iran than have died in any other conflict, all put together in the last, 40 years. And my question to you is, in the long term, how do you see, I think we see a little bit of that now, right? Because in Iraq, people are starting to...
You have your question now?
Yeah. In the long term, do you see those two divides, which do you see as ultimately creating more stability or overcoming the other?
First of all, just one small factoid. The way ethnicity historically has been considered in the Middle East was originally geographic. Starting in the 1920s and 30s, it shifted to linguistic. The point of this is Egypt on over to Morocco was not always considered Arab. Let me put that aside. Another factoid, in the Middle East, you're absolutely right in terms of the sheer scale of the war. If we want to put in what's happened in Syria, however, that may have surpassed the Iran-Iraq war, certainly the Great Lakes region in Africa. Now, the reason why sectarianism seems to be so tendentious right now in the Middle East is only 10 or 15% of the Muslim world may be Shiite, but if you draw a circle around the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula and Iran, it's about a 50-50 parity, which is why ever since around the beginning of the century, there's been a sense that absolutely everything is in play. But in conclusion, what I would argue is that people who are hell-bent on having a conflict will always come up for an excuse to have one. And that can be political, that can be religious, it can be some other aspect. What I wanted to avoid with this, and the reason we were doing a rethink, is we weren't trying to come up with a political science theory of where one size fits all. And in this case, I'll just defer that I'm a historian by training. That means I get paid to predict the past. Brian would say I only get that right about half the time. The point of this is I simply don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and those factors of Persian versus Arab or Shia versus Sunni are there. Well, I would respond, and this is not a dodge. I think my mind went to, when you raised the point, to the question that Carol asked me about Iraq, which is what's going on inside there. And I think the centerpiece of the struggle, I don't know whether those things will be resolved, and in some ways they're quite large and big, but the centerpiece of the struggle is from the bottom up, in a sense, and that struggle that is happening and is, I think, accelerating. The thing that people thought was over 2 or 3 years after the Arab uprisings is not over. And my guess, now that we're in a new decade, is that is actually going to accelerate when you look at those structural, just the basic metrics of where these societies are going. There's going to be some change. And the question is whether that change is fast or slow, the pace of it, or whether it moves in the right direction, however you define that, or tries to go back 1,000 years. And I think those internal tensions in the societies, and what I think we've seen in the last year in particular, this rise of nationalism throughout key countries of the region, is going to be where the first immediate arena where then impacts those other sort of arenas that you've talked about, Arab, Persian, Shia, Sunni. But people are going to look to what's most proximate, which is their lives, who's ruling them, and whether those who are ruling them are doing so justly and with a sense of effectiveness. And that's where I think it will be a big part of the debate in this decade.
Do we have other questions here?
Oh, wow, we do.
Oh, sir.
Yeah, Pat Spann. Spent a lot of time in the Middle East the last 20 so years. I guess I'm wondering, I blame everything on the English and French from 100 years ago when they carved up the Ottoman Empire. And you just mentioned nationalism. Seems like that's like an unheard of thing until recently. Do you actually see the nation states either recombining, like I hate to say Biden was right on something, but Iraq really is three places. Do you see, nobody wants to give up their boundaries, their current international boundaries, which to me is one of the issues that the different ethnicities, and like I say, the Kurds were promised a Kurdistan that they never got, which they're spread over, 4 countries, and none of those countries want to give up. It's like what's going on with Turkey and Syria. But I guess, do you see a day when, like as Kurdistan exists, that things happen, that the current boundaries get shifted to more natural, coherent ethnicity?
Okay. I'll respond to that briefly. Generally speaking, I actually take a little bit of issue because, of course, you're right. When you look at a map of the Middle East and you see a straight line, that's an artificial border. That doesn't mean it's an arbitrary country. So most people in the Middle East live traditionally along the coast or along rivers. And so when you consider Egypt and 90+% of the population living along the Nile, it doesn't necessarily matter where you draw the border. Egypt has a sense of being Egypt. If I had to go back through any of these countries, Iraq, of course, only became independent, I think, in 1932, but back in 13th century Arabic literature, people talked about the concept of Iraq. People talk about the concept of Lebanon or Syria long before they formally became independent. So when it comes to the artificiality of states, I'd say that the most artificial states, of course, are Jordan, Qatar, the Emirates, and Kuwait. But that many of the others, and we see this with how they retroactively extend back their national myths, have some basis in legitimacy that really isn't going to change much. If the question is the Kurds are the largest people who have been, if you will, dispossessed. And it's not 4 countries because of World War I, because of course the Treaty of Erzurum in the 17th century is what created the Iran-Iraq border. But the problem with the Kurds is, are you going to have 1 Kurdistan, or could you have 4? And this notion that we're going to have 1, well, we have 2 Romanias, one of which is called Moldova. We have 2 Albanias, one of which is called Kosovo. I think we have 22 Arab states. And so you could see some border adjustments, yes, but I don't think you're going to see a wholesale revision of the map of the Middle East as somehow illegitimate, because I think it's a lot less illegitimate than sometimes the grievance industry would have us accept.
Can I just add a little point to that? I mean, aren't we already seeing some adjustment of borders, whether it's, the Turks coming over the border into Syria and claiming some land? We have the Iranians and the Russians playing a huge role in Syria. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, Assad does not have control of his country. Let me just finish the thought. The Israelis have now made a formal claim to the Golan. I mean, don't we already see a change in borders?
There's a difference between wholesale and adjustment, and I'm also not willing to argue when you've had what's fundamentally an unresolved border issue that's separate from existing recognized borders. When it comes to Turkey, I think this is the major challenge which Recep Tayyip Erdogan is posing to the world. And I mean, KADIR can comment on this. But when we look at the fact that Cyprus remains occupied ever since 1974, was it? Mm-hmm. When we look at in Jarablus in northern Syria, Turkish civilian post offices sprouting up, I would worry a great deal about the revanchism of Erdogan and whether the world is going to be in a position to sort of respond to that, whatever his true ambition is. But we have an expert here, so I'll defer to KADIR.
I mean, the real problem is, I think, the international context has changed, has moved on from what it was, 50, 60, 70 years ago in terms of the legitimacy of changing borders, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, everything is said by and large, unless it's by choice that certain people want to leave and the others, agree to it. I'm not sure what will happen in northern Syria. I mean, Turkey is expanding. I think there's some university branches or faculties that are being opened.
But is the world ever going to see that as legitimate or just as a Turkish occupation?
Well, I mean, it's by default right now. It's occupation by definition. But I'm not sure how far he wants to go with that. It may depend on whether he can strike an agreement with Assad and Russia in terms of what kind of autonomy will Kurds get there that might threaten the Turkish Kurds, so to speak. It remains to be seen, but
I think the
way it goes, it continues this way. I don't think there's going to be a lot of legitimacy. No question.
Yeah, I mean, to this point, and I think it was a really important point you made. I think the issue is key and will be what's happening de facto, sort of what's playing out already, rather than de jure, where the formal lines are. We haven't talked at all about Yemen on this panel, and but to me, the really interesting discussion about what's happening in Yemen and whether there can be a resolution to the conflict, if you move beyond sort of the politicized thing, is what was Yemen before this conflict, and does it hang together? I kind of tried to address this in the chapter on governance about decentralization. And I think, again, if we want to be serious about diplomacy and using these other tools, understanding how different groups have defined sort of their relationship to the central government or how regions do. And, Joe Biden tried to do this 10 or 15 years ago when he had the Biden plan for Iraq, which, again, a lot of this just doesn't translate well back to our own politics, and it's not that meaningful because it's got to be organic. And the point I'd make is that this notion that was brought up about Sykes-Picot and the colonial powers, and yes, they made mistakes, but I think it would be a mistake to sort of go back to that model and try to redefine borders. It's as I was trying to say about Islam and reform, it's organic. We kind of have to watch and see how it develops. And then in a place like Yemen, what I was trying to get at is we really have to understand with more texture, which is what we try to do in the book, what are the factors of governance and political legitimacy in the different Islamist groups so that they themselves can create these new arrangements that have sort of more staying power than what we have right now.
And of course, nationalism has developed over the past 100 years in some of these artificial states.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm going to get a complaint from the Jordanians about calling them artificial because of that nationalism.
Sir?
Yeah, hi, I'm Moshe Nelson with Grant Thornton. Thank you so much for these remarks. It's been wonderful. You've covered a lot of topics in a very short period of time. One thing that was mentioned very briefly was around social media and the influence of technology in digital diplomacy, in influencing conflicts. We saw through both revolutions and surviving military coups, one way or another in Turkey, the influence of immediate responsiveness with social media. Can you touch upon digital responsiveness and how that may contribute to diplomacy or even intensifying conflicts in the Middle East?
If I could start with this and first try to relate it to the book, I think the Twitter and Facebook revolutions, as they were called, of the Arab uprisings in 2011, it produced enormous capacity for people to organize against something, to be against something, to tear things down. And I see that dynamic also in social media here in our own policy debate, that it's largely used as a tool to sort of tear after and disagree with a lot of people. But it's not all that useful, and I'm talking just in these countries. I'll get to your US diplomacy question here. It has not yet, I haven't seen a great test case or case study of building consensus and building political movements. I mean, you look at our current president. He uses his troll power very effectively to divide and fragment political coalitions at home and keep people off balance. But my main point, and I know some tech companies were looking into this, is 7 or 8 years ago, these tools that they developed were used to expand freedom, to tear down authoritarian rule and things like this. Now we're in this dangerous moment we see with China, we see with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries that aren't democracies. They are using these tech tools to reimpose control, and in very repressive ways that try to squelch dissent and debate, and that's bad. I don't see right now the U.S. playing any meaningful, serious role in all of this, including in the test case of Iran. And Michael, I hope he disagrees with me on this point. I mean, I think there's so much that's wrong about the non-policy of Donald Trump, and who knows what he just said at 11 o'clock at the top. But when the protests started again in Iran early last year, I think all we really saw was a op-ed and a polemical, rhetorical approach of this administration to talk about freedom of the Iranian people. But I didn't see any, and maybe there were different moves, but there was no serious move to talk about how do we help Iranians help themselves, to protect themselves, and have sort of VPN and other, I mean, you're probably more adept at understanding the technology here, but have a space for people to communicate with each other in Iran, those who aren't in favor of the current regime. And again, I'm not talking about military-led regime change, I'm just tools of engagement with societies. And we don't even talk about that now because of the nature of how bad our government is, and then our debate, because you can't even raise it. So I think if we move to a more functional space, less dysfunctional here at home, it would be interesting to talk about how we can use these tools to engage broader sectors of society. Back to Michael's point, that diplomats shouldn't be behind walls. Well, guess what? None of us really don't have to be behind walls, because after this panel, I can go connect with somebody conceivably in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Palestine. And have that conversation. But I don't see those tools being used in diplomacy very well right now.
A few other ways to look at this. First of all, when it comes to when it comes to the dime model, that every strategy should have a diplomatic, informational, military, and economic component, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The United States traditionally hasn't done the I in the dime model. The basis of our information strategy, such as it is to be truthful. And therefore, through truth, you build credibility. The drawback to that is that determining what the truth is slow, at which point, after 3 or 4 days, the news cycle has moved on. I've talked to people involved in information strategies in the US government who say, we're so afraid of doing anything wrong that we end up doing nothing right, especially on the military side of this. That said, one of the and if the basis of our counterinsurgency strategies in problem areas is to win hearts and minds, the Iranian influence operation strategy has traditionally been to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. There is one case in 2007 in which one of the Iranian moderate newspapers, I think Tabnak.ir, which is actually a website affiliated with Rafsanjani, said that the goal of the Americans is to convert Afghanistan to Christianity and create a new Andalusia. And okay, absolute nonsense. But then there's some contractor out in Indiana who puts biblical citation numbers on a sniper scope, and this gets picked up in the local media, and next thing you know, it's on Al Jazeera and so forth. And so that poor illiterate farmer said, I didn't believe the Iranian propaganda, but maybe there's something there, and it's just enough to get in the way of our strategy. Now, going more to what Brian said with getting out the walls, I had a conversation early on in the Trump administration with someone who was a very high-level official and basically said, look, in the Middle East, when I talk to people in the Middle East, including principals, including prime ministers, foreign ministers, and so forth, I'm using WhatsApp. Or if it's Turkey, I'm using Signal. Or if it's Iran, I'm using Telegram. And if we're still picking up the phone and calling people, it's like dealing with a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. And so that ultimately goes into the practice of diplomacy, which I think is hard to change.
So this has been a very rich discussion, and I'm sure that we could go on for probably another hour. We have to leave it there, though. Thanks to all our speakers, to Michael, to Brian, to KADIR. Thanks to you for
And to
coming.
Carol.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Okay.